So for our last session of the day, we have Alan McKay here to give a presentation on film effects in 3ds Max. I remember Alan from 2004, the master classes that we gave 3 years ago. Alan's been a pretty busy person since then. Yeah, he has now his own visual effects company called Catastrophic, probably very appropriately named. So he focuses on film video effects. He works both on his own projects and also does some outsourcing support for other studios. He also has worked on Superman Returns recently before his starting of Catastrophic. When he worked on Superman Returns, he worked both on-site in Australia, was it? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Where his accent came in very handy, obviously. And also on-site here doing some of the post-production and some of the bigger final visual effects. So anyway, I'm going to turn it over to Alan. He'll introduce the session, and enjoy.
Great. Anyway, thanks again for everyone for coming along today. Basically, what I'm going to be going through is a lot of FilmFX. I know that a lot of people are really keen to get into it, and because it is a little bit of a different approach than particle systems and dynamics, it's a little harder to kind of get your head around. So I'm hoping by giving a good introduction to how it all works that will kind of allow everyone to pick it up a lot quicker and start to do some cool stuff with it. Other than that, I'll do a bit of a show and tell on a few of the films I've worked on. I didn't get time to actually get permission to run around or get permission to do all the wireframes and show all the behind-the-scenes stuff, but I'll probably just do like a quick 10-minute session of going through the videos and going, hey, we did this, and this is the problem we ran into, and things like that. I found that to be quite useful when you go to a session and listen to everyone's problems opposed to how they succeed, because usually those little things that they spend a month or 2 months like racking their brain about, that's going to save you a month or 2 months down the line, because now you know what solution is the best for it. So I mean, I always find that kind of stuff quite interesting to check out. Other than that, a few P-flow things and a few other minor cool things to check out, so should be pretty interesting. Just give a bit more of a background. Yeah, like I do a lot of visual effects stuff. I've got Catastrophic now, which is more of a outsourcing facility for other studios. So when a company comes along and says, hey, we need a tornado and an asteroid, and they need to both hit a house at the same time, and we don't know how to do it, well, you know, usually that kind of stuff will then get passed on to my company, which allows them to kind of focus their resources onto what they're good at or what they have time for doing, and I get to blow cool stuff up, and it's always fun. All right, so what I'll just quickly do, I might just do a quick show and tell. I might just play a video, probably my reel, just to give a bit of a more of a breakdown of what I do, and I always find it cool to see a bit of eye candy, gets you all revved up for, you know, checking out other stuff later on. So anyway, that's thanks. No, that was just basically a lot of my older work, so kind of slapped together. I was looking at a lot of the Blade stuff, and Mitch Gates in the front row actually had probably the biggest amount of work to do on that show, so he's the man. Anyway, to get going with this stuff, I'm just going to go through and just kind of introduce the whole concept of FilmFX, how it works, and just a lot of tricks you can use to get it to do what you actually need it to do. I'm currently working on a film called Daybreakers in Australia. It's got William Dafoe and Ethan Hawke in it. That film is just heaps of vampires dying everywhere, and it's a lot more ambitious than a lot of the previous vampire films. A lot of close-up, slow-motion fire, and a lot of really cool, gruesome deaths. So we've been really kind of pushing Fume a lot, writing a lot of scripts and software to kind of help support it. So it's quite interesting. I'll probably spend half the session in Fume, and then I'll get on to other stuff too. So I'll kind of mix it up a little bit with that. Just to kind of introduce it quickly, Fume is located in the Create panel, just under FilmFX. The way that it works initially is that you have a container. And this means that you have a limited amount of room which you create all your fire or smoke or explosions or whatever in. And the way that that then works is that it allows it to calculate only what's necessary, opposed to infinite space, which would mean that anything can influence it and it becomes a lot more slower. So what we'll do is we'll just drag out a container here, just setting up the dimensions so that way we have like a very basic area to work within. And once we've done that, we've got the different kind of options to work with here. Unfortunately, I've got to work in 1024 by 768 for the resolution, so I've kind of got a little bit of limited room here, but I'll do my best to fit it all in. The main options I'll say would be in the General Options tab or the FilmFX GUI. And in here you've got all these different options with like infinite amount of extra stuff, and right away that does look very kind of daunting to check out, but all these things just allow you to kind of go the extra step. They're all there in plain view, but once you get yourself familiarized with all these different tabs and what they actually do, you suddenly realize, okay, well, I just need to work with these main things here and this, and this, and it becomes a lot more easier to understand. What I'll initially do is, once we create the container, we actually need to create like an emitter, so that way we can specify what object or helper is actually going to be the emitter object. So going to helpers over here, down to FilmFX, and it's going to create a simple source, and I'm just going to move that up into the container a little bit more. So if you just picture this as like the bounding box, and this inside is going to be creating fire and smoke and whatever else we want it to come out of. So going back into the modify panel, this is the emitter options. So right away we have our radius and our fuel amount and our temperature, smoke, how much smoke is being emitted initially from the source, different things like that, so we can give it initial velocity. All of these things also have like expressions and other things that we can plug into it, so we can get a lot more out of it. One thing I was really pushing for during the initial development phase of Fume was to make it completely scriptable, because After Effects isn't scriptable at all right now. It has like expressions, things like that, but if you try and control Afterburn outside of the interface, it's impossible. And that was a huge issue that I had, because you really want to be able to automate things, so that way you're not creating 50,000 shots when they're all pretty unique with a few different like variations. You want to be able to completely organize it in a way that you can just hit a button and let it do all the thinking for you. So just to kind of jump in the deep end here, what I'll do is I'll select my container, I'll go into the GUI here, and I'll just go to object source, and this is where I specify my helper object, which I've done, so now it shows up in here. So we can give it like initial temperature being a little bit higher, maybe a bit more smoke, things like that. Just to get right into seeing some results, what I'll do is I'll jump back to general, and it is a little bit muddled up, but once you familiarize yourself with it, it's not that bad. Alright, so what I'll do in here is I'm just going to, this is actually all my old cached fuel data, so I'm just going to create a new one called temp. Bless you. And I'll just throw this in here as a temp output. So what it's doing is, because you're calculating a lot of data, you can't really do it in real time, so you need to kind of cache it out whilst you're simulating. So it's kind of like RealFlow or something like that, where when you hit play, it simulates it and it writes those files to disk, allowing you to then be able to play back in real time and see your results. So I've just cached it out here. I'm just going to hit play, which is going to simulate it, this little play button. And you can see it kind of starts to scrub through here. If I click on this little preview button, we can see what it's doing. By default, it's already creating some pretty cool fire. It wouldn't hold up in a film, but if you're just creating quick fire, it might work quite well. And this is off of my laptop, so if you've got a quad-core machine with 4 gig of RAM, something like that, it's going to work out a lot better. By default, I hit play and you can't really see the effect, but again, if I hit the preview button, we can now see this in real time as we scroll through it. So this is a good way to kind of get an idea as to how it actually looks. And if you use a lot of other fluid software, it's not as interactive as this. So this is a huge advantage that it really has over the others. I've been using like Flood, which is really cool phonetic film software, but again, not the best interface, so you can't really see as much what you're doing. But then you got like RealFlow, which a bit better, but when it comes to Gaska stuff, Maya is probably the best software to kind of base it off. I found Maya's to be really good, but a little unpredictable and a lot slower, whereas this, I've just literally done that in about 30 seconds. And we got all the information playing out here as well. A few things we can do here is, with the container selected, I've actually got these channel bits of information in the modify panel. So I can actually say to look at the fire, and that way we can see some kind of viewport representation of the fire. So that way I get an idea as to, like, fire and smoke and things like that. And that'll allow me to get a better idea as to what's really happening, as well as I can hand this to an animator and they can make their character run around a room and avoid the big fire that is in the center of the room, opposed to kind of having to imagine it. So with that, I'm just going to probably just keep that on fire for the time being. What we can do is make this a little bit more interesting, and this is where we'll get into controlling it a bit more. By default, the quality is set to 5. Unless you want to create like really simple kind of like candle fire, you probably want to bump that up to like a quality of 10. And the same goes with your turbulence noise, set that to 5, which is the maximum. What these do is, quality just means obviously the iterations that go into the calculations. So you bump it up a little slower in rendering, but much better quality. And same with turbulence. This is exactly like, let's say, your material editor if you apply a noise. One thing is, like, a lot of this stuff is always based off the same kind of concept of algorithms. So you have like levels here, which will give you much more detailed levels. Lower levels, less detail. Higher it is, the more detail you get. So again, you want to have as much detail as you can in there. Right away, that will give you better results. To see them, though, you need to hit play or simulate, and that will resim it again with the new detail involved. Which I'll do in a minute, but I'll just kind of change a few more things here. Once we've added up the detail a lot more, we can give it some turbulence, and this is kind of like wind turbulence, where it'll make it a lot more kind of blowing around the room, a bit more curling, a lot more interesting. Usually for smoke and things like that, you don't really want to make it too high, because then it's going to look like it's too magical and kind of distracting. But setting to like 1, 1.5 is usually a good kind of value. If I run the sim again, now I can see it's kind of like arcing around, and that's based off the turbulence, and there is a little bit more kind of detail going on in there. You'll probably see it a lot more when I hit render, but right away you get the idea as to what's happening. Because simulating takes so long, I'm probably going to be hitting sim, show you a little bit, and then jump back in and change it again. So playing the first 60 frames, we can see that now it's kind of blowing around. It looks a lot more interesting. The arcs are quite big, so what I'll probably do is bring the scale down. I'll put it down to 5 probably, and that will make the size of the noise, again, if you're looking here, make it a lot smaller, opposed to making it quite big. So that's what we're doing here, is bring the scale down. It's shrinking the noise size down. Frames is actually the animation. So what that does is, the longer it takes to have it cycle through a phase. So we set that to 50, it would actually animate slower, I believe. And if we set to like 1, it's going to happen a lot quicker. It might actually be the other way around. I get confused when it comes to that tab, because a few of them are a little bit, the naming is a bit confusing as to what it actually represents. But essentially this controls how quickly it'll phase through the turbulence. So I'll just leave it as is. And now what you'll find is we got this really tiny, kind of tighter turbulence kind of moving and shifting around. And this kind of gives it a bit more kind of an interesting look. What I might do is just bump up the turbulence a little bit more. The main things to look into here is like things like fuel, which pretty much drives all the fire. For the time being, I'm going to turn off simulate smoke, so we can just focus on the fire, and then I'll get into all the other stuff. I just realized I'm still in Australia time here, but 11 in the morning tomorrow. Alright, so if we turn off smoke, all we're doing is we're simulating fire, which is a lot quicker to work with. So that just means we can get a lot more done, because it's not having to simulate. As you can see, it kicks back to the old cached files after it gets to that point. But if you just want to simulate fire, turn off smoke, and that way what you get is it doesn't need to calculate all the smoke kind of filling up the container, and that means it has less to calculate, which is pretty useful a lot of the time. What I actually find is, and this is more of a production tip, if you're simulating like really detailed fire and then the smoke isn't as important, sometimes it's actually more useful to simulate the fire as a detailed pass and then simulate the smoke as a less detailed pass, or even use afterburn or something, so that way you can get all the detail you need into the fire without needing to worry about the smoke having to calculate and simulate throughout that time frame. There's actually also a lot of tools I've written for Fume, which I'll probably put on my website at some point when I get 5 minutes to breathe. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff that just allows you to batch simulate and just do a few more interesting things like that. So just to jump into it a bit quicker here, burn rate, basically that allows you to make it so it burns quicker, so you can get like much quicker death on the fire. If the lower it is, the longer the fire will actually stick around. So if you want to get like really big fire that's more graceful and plumes up slowly, this is the way to go, because if you bring your burn rate down, it isn't going to burn through the fuel as fast. So what you get is a lot more lingering kind of fire. Obviously that turbulence is a little bit too strong. I'll bring that up to about 11 and bring the turbulence strength down a little bit. But yeah, this is the best way to kind of get really kind of graceful kind of fire if you want like slow moving kind of phasing fire. But if you want something that's burning really quickly and a lot more violently, then you probably want to pump this up to like 30 or 40, and that way you get fire that burns very quick. And that in a way is a good control for managing the length of your fire and like what type of fire it is. I also brought the turbulence down here so it's not as strong, so it's a bit more graceful. But as you can see, it dies out a lot quicker. So I mean, those are a few basic things to keep in mind. The other thing that I'll jump into here is spacing, and that is kind of like the voxel size. So if you bring the spacing up, this little icon here represents 1 voxel. So the higher it is, as we can see, the size here is a lot smaller, meaning it's going to be these really big voxels, which are going to look really blocky and terrible. So, I mean, that looks pretty bad. But you bring it right down. Usually I'd say a good standard kind of solid scale would be about 150 in any of these axes, or dimensions, sorry. And that you know is going to render. It's not going to run out of memory or anything like that. So if you put it to like 140 in length or whatever, you're going to get much slower kind of simulations, but they do look a lot more interesting. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But obviously, when you're just testing out your fire and you're getting an idea as to how it's going to look, you bring that to a lower value. And then when you go to render or do your final simulation, you bump it up or down to a smaller size. Just to render frames, you can get an idea as to how quick this stuff renders. It's very quick. So getting back into simulation, and the way this is broken up is just like general stuff. So like the dimensions of your container, where you're outputting to, the frame lengths and things like that. Playback, which is important. If you simulate and then you want to get another container and offset it, this is a good way to kind of shift the timing of it. And just a few things like that to allow you to get the most out of your simulation. Simulation is all your simulation settings, so here's where you do all your calculations. What I'll do is I'll bring the burn rate down. I'll make it expand. Expansion means it's going to blow out, whereas bringing the expansion lower means it's actually going to compress inward. Usually fire won't compress inward that much, but this is a good way to make explosions and things like that, so that's good to keep in mind. Fuel creates smoke. This means that when a particle or a voxel of fire dies, rather than just disappearing, what it'll do is it'll turn into smoke. That way you get a realistic simulation of fire burning, and then as it fizzles out, it'll turn to smoke and blow away. That way, rather than having to do your smoke emitting from your emitter, you just have it realistically create smoke as it begins to die out. So there's a few little tricks there that are quite useful for getting a lot out of it. What I'll do here is I'll bring the expansion up, heat production I'll ramp right up, and I'll go into my object source, and I'll bring my temperature up a little bit. And here we'll probably get a much more interesting kind of bigger fireball happening. Obviously pretty big, but you know, obviously you can see it's going to be a lot bigger. This is based on the expansion and also the heat production. So I'll bring that down. The way fluids work is usually you have heat, and that's going to control everything. Like fuel creates fire, and then the heat will control how quick it's going to explode, or how subtle it's going to be, or whatever options you want. The other things are, once you've simulated this, obviously you can play back the simulation, but you can jump into the rendering tab, and this is the good thing, is once it's simulated, it's done the simulation, so then you can get in and change the look of it. So I can change the color or anything else I want through here. So if I want, I can get this to, I could right click here and change this to change the color over time or whatever else I needed. And this is just like a tip that I found when working with this stuff. Unfortunately, the rendering, like Max's volumetrics right now, you may or may not have noticed, they output 8-bit, which is a bit distracting because you render out a 32-bit float image or EXR, and then suddenly you realize all your color depth is actually still 8-bit. So that is one big flaw. But I'm getting Kresmer at the moment, hopefully, to write his own custom renderer, which will allow you to render out float, meaning you get all the color range you need. Because when you're rendering close-up fire of like a little girl's face burning up, as I'm doing right now, yeah, you want to see all the color and range you can get out of it. You want to really push the contrast and all the levels and exposure in the shot. And that's actually what I've got to do is a nice sunrise shot of a girl deciding to kill herself by watching the sunrise and having her face burn up, and it's really terrifying and ugly shot. And it's daylight, so you really want to get as much color range as you can get out of it. And right now it is quite limiting because of the fact that you only get 8-bit. So what we're finding is that I'll try and work in using red, green, and blue channels, because like your blue channel is going to have the least amount of color information. The screen here is a bit darker, so you can't really see it as much, but the blue channel is very subtle. The green channel, you get a bit more information, and then the red is like really blows out. So I'll usually render my stuff like a lower exposure. And this is something we did for Superman Returns as well, because we have that issue, and I'll get into that later on, but we're having to render out 8-bit 2K renders of like the sun exploding and not having the color range. What we did is we render out in V-Ray just 2 or 3 different exposures, so that we can kind of bring that together and have the color range that we actually needed to get some things to blow out and other things to be a lot more kind of lower and subtle. So I'll usually render things out a little lower in exposure, and that way I get a lot more control out of it. And I might also, if I want to make a red, green, blue pass, I actually find also just making a blue can kind of give it a nicer look as well. So there's a few little subtle things you can do that really kind of give you the maximum kind of control you actually need in your comps. And again, when you're rendering out effects, time's not on your side, and neither is computer power. So you want to get your renders right the first time and not need to go back and not need to change things. And you don't want to get a call at 4 in the morning going, "Hey Alan, can you come back into work? That render was from the wrong camera, and you have a teapot including the camera, so yeah, we're going to need that one again." So fortunately that's never happened, but it's best to get things right the first time. So again, we got 3 channels. Red, we notice it blows out a bit, which may not be bad. Green, get a lot of color range. Blue, as you can see, this one's like the most light amount of color. So, and then you get the alpha, which is usually quite interesting as well. So when you render out any given image, you're actually getting 4 passes. You're getting the alpha, you're getting the red, green, and blue, and all of these together allow you to use them as a luminance pass. Like if you're in Fusion, just do a channel boolean and pull the green in as the alpha or whatever you need. But this means you can split up all these different things to get the most out of that one particular pass. I'm just going to jump into like some kind of random fire pass just quick, so that way I can kind of look at this on a more practical level. Okay, so here's something I prepared earlier. So this is just some fire I've kind of rendered out. It's playing back a little slow. One thing I always point out with whether you're doing effects or particles, but this is kind of overlooked a lot of the time, but like if you right click on your play button, you've got real time. And I've actually made like a hotkey for that, because if I'm working with character animation or a simple scene, you want to have it play out at the rate that it should be playing out at. So characters running through and there's puffs coming, you want to be able to get the timing right and everything else. But then when you're working with really dense scenes and you hit play, it's going to like chop through the shot. It's going to be very choppy, because it's trying to keep the same playback rate, but also keep the calculations up. If you turn off real time, what's going to happen is it's going to play back at the rate that it needs to. So when it gets slow, it's still going to render out each and every frame, giving you a much more kind of smoother playback when you're testing or looking at the feel of your motion. So this example here, I've just got some fire which kind of like plumes up and turns to smoke. It's not too interesting, but it's a good kind of scenario to work in. What I've done is I've simulated that data out already I've rendered all that stuff out. So that way I load up the file, the cache is all there. And this is something that when you are simulating over the network or whatever, you have all your files accessible on the network, so that way any machine can grab this data. Again, it can get slow because these files are quite big. Actually, these are quite small, but you're looking at like 8 to 14 megs sometimes for some of your simulations for each and every frame. I quickly filled up a terabyte of space just on fluid sim data. So it has a lot of information. You can tell it not to output as much information if you want. By default, it only outputs like fuel, and if you're doing smoke, then it'll output smoke. But you can also output fluid mapping, which is pretty important. I'll get into that in a bit. Velocity, which doesn't get used right now, but it does for motion blur. That's one thing. If you're doing any motion blur, then you probably want to do that. And temperature. One thing that I've found, like, if you're using any kind of software that kind of samples all your pixels and slows it down, like retime or anything like that, fire has always been a huge issue because it doesn't really work too well. I'd never really used Real Smart Motion Blur before, and then I was working on Bioshock over at Blur Studio, and Tim Jones and I were sitting there trying to get motion blur to look good for these stupid hornets that were in the shot. And Tim Miller was like, "Oh, I just use Real Smart Motion Blur," and we're both like shaking our head, going, "That's not going to work. It's stupid." But saying, "Yeah, we'll do that, boss." And we actually tried it, and it worked really well. Real Smart Motion Blur worked perfectly for doing like even the most complicated simulations of things going all over the shop. It'll be able to do really nice kind of motion blur for that. So things like fire, again, it works out quite well to try stuff like that out because you actually get good results, which I didn't expect. And hopefully they'll give me $5 for saying that. So getting back into this, we got some fire here kind of popping out. And again, we can play with the coloring of this and kind of make it a lot more interesting. One thing, again, it comes down to your style and like how you work, but you'll notice some people like to do like really nice lower, like not too contrasty kind of effects, and other people like to blow their stuff out. I'm kind of one of those people who, when it comes to fire, really like to have like a high exposure, like make it like really blow out and like really be really intense. So, here I'll have like a really big fireball like that instead of like the duller kind, but then you get a lot more interesting kind of look to it. But using your AFC controller, things like that, you're able to control the density of like where it distributes. And I hate this about I don't know what Kresma does with his products like Afterburn and Fume, but occasionally I can't insert points into the graph, which is just annoying. But yeah, I just reset it, so now it's working. Great. All right, so again, just as a generic kind of fire, it's not working. Well, usually what you do, I'll show it on one of the other ones, but you usually want it to peak around here, which is the main body of it, and then fall off here, which is like where all the smoke and the edges are. So kind of picture this, actually it might be the other way around. Yeah, so this is kind of like from the center of the fire or the voxel all the way to the edge. So you usually, you'd have a blowout, actually other way around, I think. I haven't used Fume in a week and I've forgotten it all. No, but yeah, you kind of want this to be the center body of how you work, and usually kind of not too sharp, but sharp enough that you're able to get some good kind of edging in there. But that'll work for the time being. Okay, so that way we get some cool kind of results, and then with the smoke I can bring the opacity down, make it a lot more thinner and less distracting. That way you get some cool kind of fire. And I'll get into a bit more about how this kind of all works and how to make, how to get a specific kind of fire opposed to, Fume makes fire and this is the only fire it does. You can get big fireballs or really subtle kind of candlelight flames. You get a lot of different effects. So, I mean, it is quite interesting. So I'll get into that in a bit. But here, we've got all these kind of different controls for your opacity and color and things like that, so they'll work out well. And what I might do, I'm going to turn off smoke for the time being, so I'm not simulating the smoke. That means I'll get faster simulation times. And I'm just going to call this, I'm going to output as B so I don't override it. But what we can do is, I'll just introduce one thing called fluid mapping. And if you click on simulation, because it's a simulation effect. Click on fluid mapping, and what that will allow us to do is actually kind of map textures onto the voxels, meaning that for the density you can get some very interesting kind of results where you can get a lot more detail kind of going into your fire than before. And that's one thing that I've found is quite important, is because these are such slow simulations. You're looking at like 2 or 3 hours, sometimes 5 hours to simulate a good film shot. You want to be able to fit as much in there as you can. So if you can't get it there, then you can actually use a texture map to do that. And that's what I'll do here. So I've enabled, in simulation, I've enabled the fluid mapping, and that, if you look back at the channels, you should see now fluid mapping showing up. So what I'll do is I'll get this fire or one similar, and I can actually put that into, under rendering fire, we'll click on this and enable fluid mapping, and drag that onto the opacity. And what this map thing here is the influence. Like 100 is 100% of the texture, or else you could bring down to 0 and it's going to be 100% on the voxels. So that's a good way if you go, okay, well, I want it to be more the texture map than anything else, and you probably bump that up to 90 or something like that. That will give you a lot more influence by the texture map. So what I'll do is I'll just bump up the levels, and I'll just quickly simulate this. It's a little bit slow, but you get the idea. And what that's doing is it's kind of mapping the density based on like a noise algorithm. It's controlling the density based on this texture map, which means also you can adjust that in real time. You can animate it, and you can kind of force it to have a lot more detail. It can kind of sometimes be subtle, but you can get a lot more control out of that. So you might be able to see it too much, but ultimately it allows you to kind of really control where it's being fit in. So this is probably not the best example, but you can definitely get a lot more kind of influence from it. And especially smoke, things like that, you're able to get it to essentially have all that detail that you might be able to get from the simulation. Smoke is actually probably the best example where you can get some good results. Let's bump this down a little bit so we can see it. But yes, I mean, that is something to look into, and that way you can get like some really kind of cool edging. Again, because we're having when you're doing a demo of fluids, it's a lot harder to be able to do stuff in real time. But what I might quickly jump into is just how to create like explosions and a lot of those things, because I find they can be quite interesting. I'm just going to reset the scene, so we start out with a fresh max. Go FilmFX, and I'm just going to drag out a container. And like I said, the first few times you use Fume, it is a bit overwhelming, but after a while, you really kind of get into the fundamentals of how it all works. So I'll just go down and create a source. And one or two of the other things we need to quickly cover is just how to create fuel, how to create custom fuel, as well as fuel maps and things like that, because they are the things that allow you to get the most out of fluids. So I'm just going to go back into my GUI here. I've added the source in, and we'll just set this up to be fairly big temperature and a lot of smoke. And again, I'm just going to call this temp. Bring up the container a little bit. Alright, so the key things here, we'll put up the detail like we had before. I'll give it a little bit of turbulence, not too much, so I'll bring that up. Bring the scale down. And lastly, I'll bring the expansion up a little bit. The only other thing I'm going to do is going back into my object source. The fuel right now is emitting constantly, so we're just going to give like one big burst of fuel and then probably stop. So I'm just going to animate the temperature and fuel probably just to turn off over time. So I'll select my source and just Get rid of that. All right, so now it kind of animates down over a couple of frames, and that means we just have this initial kind of blast of fire coming out. So we'll take a quick look at that and just see how it looks. And there is no magic button. As with anything, you really do need to kind of play around and get an idea as to how it's going to look. One thing is the smoke by default actually defaults to white, which is a little bit harder to see, so we'll change that in a second. But even there, we might be able to see the initial framing of that, so we get to see it's kind of blows out a little bit. All right, so I'm just going to bring the smoke color down so it's a little less distracting. All right, so it blows out quite kind of quickly. Once you've done that, you're able to look at it and go, okay, well, the fire stops after a few frames, which is kind of good and bad, but I might make it last a little bit longer, so I'll extend the keyframes a little bit, and I'll bring the turbulence down a little bit and the scale right down, so about 7, and I might make the expansion a tiny bit bigger. So let's try that and see how it looks. Okay, obviously expansion now is pushing it to expand a lot bigger, so we get a bigger initial explosion, after which, because the temperature is animating down, it tends to diffuse out into smoke. What we can do is keep the temperature up, and that will make it continue to plume up until we adjust the burn rate. Once you get a handle on this, you can then use particle systems as well and things like that to allow you to really get a lot out of it. You can automate a lot of this stuff, so you do a simulation of jets flying overhead and dropping these bombs down, and each time they create a particle system that can be fed into FilmFX and creates a nice explosion based on that. The only thing is you need to make the containers kind of specific to where the explosions are. So we're getting to see some cool results where the explosion is coming out and then kind of begins to plume upward. I might make the voxel size smaller so we can get it to sim a bit quicker. But alright, so that's the first initial pieces of it, so we're getting to really kind of plume out. What I can also do is I might get my emitter here, and I'll get the temperature to last a little longer. And lastly, also, this isn't very advertised, but it is quite useful. Control-Shift-F allows you to toggle your fume GUI. They're actually going to make it so this can actually sit up all the time, because when you deselect your container, it disappears, which is really annoying. But in the later versions of Fume, that's going to be fixed, which will be quite cool. Okay, so what I was going to do, the burn rate, I was going to adjust it down a little bit, and that will mean that the flames will last a little bit longer. Heat production will bump up as well. And lastly, I just kind of make the voxel size a little smaller. And this just means we get a quicker explosion. After this explosion is done, I'll just load up one I've prepared earlier, purely as that way we can kind of see more of a final result and what kind of settings were involved. But right away we can see that this is working quite well. We get a big kind of initial fire that then begins to lower its temperature and dissipate into a big smoky plume. And from here what we would do is start working on the smoke, getting it to really kind of have that better kind of plumy look. We'd also probably have a secondary emitter that would blow horizontally outward. The other thing that we've got is we can see it's clipping on the top of it, so you'd want your container to be a lot bigger. But I'll just play those frames. But we get a cool kind of explosion coming out. And, you know, again, rendering this out and using a bit of glow, stuff like that, you'd get able to get some cool results from it. Might just play with the color a little bit here. Right. So again, fluid mapping, I'd be able to create some more interesting effects with it too. You got other things like soften your edges, which means that if you got an object, it won't have harsh clipping around the object. Very important. Those little things allow you to avoid artifacts. And these controls in here allow you to get rid of any artifacts and kind of make things a bit smoother if they need to be too. One other thing to keep in mind, if you like the motion but it's a little bit too quick, you can adjust the timescale down. That will slow it down, and that's quite important when you're dealing with different scales, because if you're doing a lot of simulations, you don't want to have to create like a 50-foot tall giant explosion and then create a really small one too. What you might do is get the same container and then copy it and then adjust the time scale, and that way it'll play out a lot quicker, giving it a sense of smaller scale. Or if you want it to actually look a lot bigger, you might bring it back a bit, and that way it gives it a bigger kind of feel of mass about it. So that's looking pretty cool. What I probably might do, bring the turbulence a little bit again. Also, in your object source, you have some turbulence down the bottom here, and this is more for how it's emitting, making it a bit more natural, things like that. That can be quite useful. And also vorticity, again in simulation, this allows you to get more of a kind of broken up feel to it. So there's a lot of different controls, but they all kind of work together quite well. Lastly, what I might do is keep the smoke going, and I might tell it to create smoke just a little bit. And lastly, with this emitter, I'll keep it going for a lot longer now, and we'll just get to see a bit more of what it's doing. This will probably be the last simulation, and then I'll jump onto some other stuff. Right away, I think the turbulence is probably a little bit too strong, but it's all good. So I'll let that go. But this is pretty cool because, again, you can get particles to interact with this. You can get like everything else around you. So when you got objects in the scene, they'll kind of push through as well. Everything in Max, it can work and communicate quite well. I'm actually using, for Daybreakers, this vampire film, other 3D software too, and we've got it to the point where we can render out stuff from one software that feeds into Max, render that stuff out and comp it back in. It's pixel perfect with everything. So you can do some really interesting stuff, and everything is backwards compatible. And again, Fume is fully scriptable, meaning that you can kind of take it to the next level with a lot of stuff. Other than that, you can also control the voxels. Every single voxel is actually scriptable, which is pretty useful. So that looks good. I'm pretty happy with that. We can see the last little bits of the fire kind of dying out. So let's play that. And we can see we've got a really cool kind of fireball explosion happening. And you can imagine if we kept the fire going, it'd continue to burn away, because right now I'm turning off the temperature and fuel. But that's a cool way to create some initial kind of explosive effects. I'll save that. Alright, so going back a bit, here's another explosion. Again, pretty same kind of effects. Let's render out a frame. So again, with all of this, I'm rendering at like demo voxel size. So you want it to be a lot more detailed, and that's what you do for production. That's what I kind of hate about, what I love and hate, I should say, about doing demo stuff is that usually what you're showing isn't that interesting, but the concept behind it is. So, you get some R&D guys who jump up and down with joy when like they get some object to turn green instead of blue because of some event, and you're looking at it going, yeah, what's so exciting about that? But then when you pass it over to the animators to plug into their effect with this other shader, suddenly you got this cool explosion that like blows up when a certain person does a certain thing or whatever. And the whole idea is that you're showing the theories behind a lot of these cool concepts, but unfortunately you got to show them in real time, and you can't use necessarily production quality scenes because they're all copyrighted and everything else, so it kind of does get frustrating. But so this explosion is kind of similar. We have it kind of blowing out here, and then over time it begins to kind of phase out into smoke. And again, the way this is all being done is we've got smoke, we've got a curve here and things like that to get to control where the fire is and how much it dominates, as in having too much influence there. But alright, so I can really kind of push the area that it controls. Let's get rid of that. change that look altogether. We can bump up how much it blows out or bring it right down. So these controls, again, this is the beauty of being able to do it in real time, because you've cached out the stuff, so now you're working on the actual look. We can make the smoke actually really thin. I nearly said skinny for some reason. Or we can actually make it really dense, and that means it's going to be like volcanic kind of render. Let's go to a more drastic frame. So you can make like thicker or thinner or whatever you want. And yeah, those controls, again, completely customizable. Getting into some more kind of left-wing stuff, but it's quite useful to know. I might actually just load up a different scene that we can work from. Alright, here's some fire. Kind of blowing out. I've actually shown that one, but I'm not sure if we've got the scene loaded. Yeah, I don't think I've seen that yet. But what we've got is we can emit fire from objects, and we can actually emit from specific areas on an object. So if you wanted, and this is something that we're doing on this vampire film, is having a character burn up and dissipate, and having it all driven off of one texture map, and that way you can get that approved and then feed off the fuel to generate the fire, and a lot more interesting kind of things like those types of results. So what I'll do quickly here is generate a container. I'll bring the scale of this down a little bit. And what I'm going to do on this is I'm going to generate fuel on the actual object. And this means we can get some really good control out of it. Okay, so again, we've got our container. I'm just going to go to helpers. And what time is this finished, by the way? It's 7. Okay, cool. Well, I'll hurry up. I'll talk really fast and see if you can understand me. We'll get object source, add that in, and add in the sphere. Now, what that's doing is instead of a simple source, it's an object source. I'm just going to add that and output it to, call it temp2. Alright, so if I simulate this, it's going to emit off the object, which is pretty cool. Objects are a little slower. Keep that in mind. If you don't need to use an object, don't use it, because they do tend to be a little slower, but they're a lot more useful when you're emitting from like a person running around on fire or whatever. Thing is, it's emitting from the whole entire object. So what I can do here is, let's say I apply a noise map, make it show up in the viewport. Because the simulation is quite low, it's going to need to be a fairly big thing. Okay, let's just say we do something like this. Okay, so it's going to emit from a black and white image, and I'm just going to call this fuel mask. And what I can do is get this texture and go down to fuel, set it to based on intensity. I'd even set it to red, green, or blue, so we could output like a texture map that is like 4 or 5 different layers of stuff. So one could be the skin layer, one could be the fire layer, one could be the smoke layer, and we can pump in different things like a red, green, blue pass, and that would allow us to read a lot more information off of the one specific texture map. But I'm going to drag this in as intensity, like a black and white image. And I might need to give it a bit more detail, but this right away means that we're emitting fire from this one specific area. Now, if you can imagine this as like Blade or some kind of vampire film where you have initial kind of gradient or something expanding over the body, and as that happens, it's going to generate like a blend map between the character and between the burnt areas, and it also might generate fire, things like that. You can have it all kind of come together, and here we have fire coming off of just that one bit. You might question why there's smoke coming off of the whole entire object, and that is because we're having smoke coming specifically from the whole object. So I can say as well, emit from this texture map, and what will happen then is it'll emit specifically smoke and fire from just there. Or I can turn smoke off completely and there won't be any smoke. But then I can go in the simulation and tell the smoke here, like the fuel, to create smoke. And what will happen is as the fire comes up and dissipates, it turns to smoke. It might look the same here, but what's actually happening is when the fire begins to die out, it's turning into smoke. You get a lot more of a kind of subtle look to it. I'm just going to bump up the detail a little bit, add a bit of turbulence again, bring the scale down, expansion a tiny bit, heat production a lot, burn rate lower. And that's one thing I like about this is the more you familiarize yourself with trying out different things, the more you can like look in dailies and the director says, oh, I want this to be really dynamic and I want this to be cool, and a bunch of like non-directional requests. But yeah, like you can literally look at the dailies and go, okay, so I think I need that value and I need this, and you write down all the settings, you walk back to your computer and just type them all in, hit render and walk away, because like you get to understand what does what and how it all reacts together. So here we've got a texture map and the fire is burning quite interestingly off of the object. What I can do now to make this a bit more interesting is animate the phase of this. So we have this texture moving over the object over time. Again, hit simulate. And what's going to happen is the texture is going to shift over the object as it phases around. And again, you can really influence that as much as you need to. I'll wrap this up. I kind of figured an hour and a half is going to be so hard to fill up, but yeah, it's obviously going quite quickly. But again, like that is like a really influential thing, is to be able to do that, where we're able to specify where texture gets emitted from. Again, fuel is everything. So here is an example I've got of just a particle system moving through the shot. And what this is I've got a FilmFX particle source. But rather than this tell it to be like to emit fire, I'm actually telling it just to emit fuel, no temperature. So what we get in here is I've got the object source, which is down here, and then we have the particle source, which is only fuel. So what I've got, if you can imagine, is fire burning at the bottom of this container. And then fuel, I don't know how, but magically it begins to blow past it off of this star shape. And you can imagine when the fuel comes in contact with the fire, it's going to ignite. So we have, if you guys can see that all right, it might be a little bit hard. I'll bump up the color a little bit. Okay, so yeah, you can see now that we have fire and then fuel comes by, and because this is purely only fuel, it's not got any temperature to it, it's not going to ignite. And again, when you control, you've got the ignition temperature here, and this tells it, you have to be a certain amount of temperature before you ignite. And here I've just set it to 0 for the time being. What's happening is we've got fuel blowing past, which then lights on fire. So you can imagine having a particle system of gasoline being poured and it dripping down near a fire, and as it gets close, that's when it ignites and burns away really quickly, and you get these cool kind of results. And one last example of that. Same kind of thing. As you can see, I've just got this particle system blowing around in the center, and what we get then is this cool kind of fire undulating around because of that. And again, this is like where you get a lot more control and influence from it. And these simulations, I think this one was practically real time. It like took a few seconds to simulate, but you get some really cool kind of fire results from doing these kind of things. So fuel is like one thing that really kind of drives how you use fire and what how you kind of control it. I've got another 15 minutes, so I'm just kind of jump through one or two more tiny things, and then we'll move on. Let's see. One last thing I'll go through, and then I'll just open up the Q&A. Is the big, I think it's like, 1.5 minutes almost, shot of the sun blowing up. So I'll play this through real quick. This shot here was one of these shots that initially was like the big complex shot. And what had happened was that it was this really dynamic shot where the camera flies through the sun, does all this stuff. And they realized, okay, it's going to be a little too complicated and a lot of money, so we're not going to do that. Unfortunately, the movie got so long that about 3 weeks or 4 weeks before the movie was due out, they decided to can half of the, like, was it 30 minutes of the film, which was the opening sequence, and they put it on the DVD, of course, but yeah, they suddenly had no opening sequence. So I got a call. I just finished 6 jobs. I was working throughout the night on 6 different productions. Try doing one, we'll try doing 6. It's a lot of pain. I was doing 6 jobs for E3, trying to get all these game cinematics done, and then I got a phone call. Literally, when I've just finished, I'm about to take a month's holiday. I got a phone call saying, "Can you be in LA like 2 days from now?" And I was in Australia at the time, so it's like, okay, I haven't slept in a few days and whatever else, and I'm ready to crash, but all right, fine. So I hopped on a plane, I get over here, and we're told that we've got to do one shot for 1.5 minutes, all CG, in 3 weeks. And it was one of those, like, okay, it might be doable if it's like a bouncing ball or whatever. It's like, no, it's pull out of Krypton, sun imploding, blowing up, destroying Krypton, and then all the pieces flying past the camera. So we had like maybe 12 people, or maybe a little bit more, I'm not sure, but a lot of people working on like everything from matte paintings to all the 3D environment. All this is like geometry with some matte painting stuff to fix it up. Then we kind of pull out, and as we get further away, we revealed the sun. And I think everyone had a go at trying to build this. I think in the end it was a mixture of Chris Pember and Marcus Steeds over in Winnipeg, Phoenix Films head office. And they created the sun, which is really cool. And we used P-Flow for this. Oleg Bariborden, who created P-Flow, he and I worked on the sun exploding. So what happens is we have the initial flare, and then we have the outer rim, all the brown stuff, which is Oleg. He created all these custom operators for it to create like all these particles. There's about 70 million particles in the shot. It's pretty intense. And then all the blue stuff and Krypton blowing up and everything is all mine. So it was one of these things where nobody really even knew how it was going to look, and we had to create this whole effect, and no one really had an idea as what to do. We just kind of jumped in there and just went for it, and it was a lot of work, but it looked great. What I ended up doing for this was multiple passes of like lots of different stuff. Initially, I used afterburn combustion with like 2 or 3 layers of kind of like atmospheric kind of blowing out, and then lots of different variations of like particle passes of little particles and trails and things like that. Apparently, Brian Singer dubbed my my particles particle sperm. I don't know why, but so he's like, "Man, yeah, I really love that particle sperm. It's like great." And I'm like, "Okay, great. I create particle sperm for Superman. That's what I do. Awesome." One thing I had a lot of fun with this shot, though, you know, it's one of those things that you want to do a homage to something else. And when Krypton blows up, I actually snuck like a 3D Studio Max teapot into the shot. So you can't see it on the screen here, but one of the pieces of debris that when Krypton explodes is actually a 3D Studio Max teapot. And so as it all blows up, there's like chunks of debris and everything else. And unfortunately, you know, usually sneak the stuff in once the shot's been finished, and that way no one's going to really pick up on it. Instead of what I had to do was when Brian Singer's going through frame by frame on like a big cinema screen. So, you know, it's one of those things, you know, it's very hard to kind of sneak in there, but I managed to get it in there, so I'm kind of happy. But I can just picture him being like, yeah, this is great. It's got the original feel here, and yeah, it's got like cool visual effects, and is that a teapot? Like, what is that doing in my shot? Why is there a teapot? But it worked out well, and again, you know, everyone busted their ass on that shot, but it worked out well, and I'm happy. And you know, again, like FilmFX, I'm going to be doing a few demos at Turbo Squid, so that'll be cool. You'll be able to check it all out, and I'll probably start releasing a few tutorials just to get everyone a bit more into it. I really wish I had more time to show more stuff, but unfortunately I waffled on for too long. But thanks again, everyone, for coming along.